Hi students! So we're back with part 4, add color for our watercolor painting. So when we're using watercolors, we often will work from the background of our picture and move into the foreground of our picture. And we'll often also work from light to dark. With watercolors, we go from light to dark. With most other mediums or materials, we go from dark to light, but watercolors are a bit different. All right, so keeping that in mind, what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to mix a wash, as you guys are familiar with. So I'm going to make a little puddle of paint on my palette. I have some other paint on my palette, and I'm just kind of including it in my paint puddle because it's blue, and my reference image has a blue sky and also blue water in it. So I'm going to just paint some washes of various colors. And I'm just basically painting these big chunks of color to get some color down. So this is my background. Remember, we're going from background to foreground. So we're kind of like building up our washes. And like after we've done one wash, we will let it dry. And then we go back in with a bit of a darker wash. So I'm doing for my sky, I'm doing some lifting wet, because I want to keep that white area of the clouds. I want to keep it light. So I'm just lifting some water or some of the paint off of my paper. So we'll remember that technique from our previous video. All right, so now I'm just mixing a little bit of green into my blue wash, and I'm going to paint the water area using just a flat wash. And I'm trying to be careful to not let the two washes bleed into each other or blend in with each other. I want to let those areas dry. And I'm going to dry my brush off and kind of lift a little bit of white areas, sort of to make those reflections on the water that I can see in my reference image. All right, we need to let our work dry at certain points because watercolor can get really out of control if you don't let things dry. So I've let my two washes dry. If you notice, they're a lot lighter than they were when they were wet. And now I'm going to paint some of those green and brown sections in. Okay, so I'm just mixing a brown color, and I'm using red and green to mix brown. I just feel like it makes a nice richer brown than what is on my palette. So I've mixed a brown wash, and I'm going to paint this whole entire area. Even though I can see a bunch of different colors of brown in my reference image, I'm going to paint the full area just a middle kind of brown. And then I'm going to go in with darker washes later to add those other colors I see. So in watercolor, oftentimes we're just sort of, like I said, starting with a light wash and building up with darker washes. Okay, and I'm going to paint this tree. I can see a tiny little stripe of like brown underneath those trees in the very, very background, or in the midground, I guess. Okay, so I'm going to let this dry as well. Okay, so just a reminder, we're going from light to dark. So look how light my washes are. I need some dark areas added. I'm trying to get contrast here, right? So what I'm doing is I'm mixing that in my reference image. As you can see, that like orangish color. So I'm going to block in those areas. And another thing you can think about while you're working is how we're going from not detailed to detailed. So imagine if I were squinting my eyes at this picture, I don't see a lot of detail, and as I open my eyes, I start to see more detail. So it's like that. I'm going from blurry to focused almost. All right, so I'm now adding in some tree green, and I'm using lighter green, and then later I'll go in with a darker sort of brownish green to add those trees in. So as I've mentioned, so I'm going from light to dark. So now I'm looking at that dark brown color that I'm noticing in the front of my image or on the Canadian Shield rock. And I'm just looking at the reference image and sort of trying to block those areas in. And I'm using a big brush, like I'm using a square brush that's quite big. I'm just doing larger areas of color. And later I'll start to use a smaller brush. All right, so I'll be blocking in those brown areas. And now what I'm doing is I'm noticing in the front there's like this lichen growing on the rock. So I am putting those guys in, the lichen in. I'm planning on using salt texture for that. So I'm putting some sort of green paint, dotting it using kind of a pointillism technique, a dry brushing technique as well. Putting some little green dots, and then I'm gonna throw some salt on top of there using the salt technique that we learned about a couple weeks ago. So there we go, I've got some salt and I'm sprinkling it on. So just a reminder with the salt technique, we're meant to sprinkle it on when the paint is wet, and once the paint dries, we just brush the salt off. So we're not trying to let the salt stay on the artwork, we're brushing that off afterwards. All right, so now I've grabbed a small brush, a very small brush, and I'm just taking some mid-brown colored wash, and I'm just going and doing some of the details that I'm noticing, the cracking detail that I'm noticing in the rock, in the foreground of my art. All right, so remember when I said we would talk about the trees? I'm going to show a couple different techniques for painting trees. So as I'm going for contrast, I've mixed quite a dark colored wash, a brownish green wash, and I'm just going to paint sort of like a vertical line, and then I'm going to make these little branches just coming out by using sort of the side of my brush. So I'm not drawing like a puffy ball with a trunk like I normally would do with a tree. I'm doing a vertical line and then having those branches branching offwards. And this is a very not detailed version of a tree. I'm trying to look at my reference image as well to see what my tree actually looks like. And then what I could do after is I could grab my small brush and do some details. And in this area, I'm doing a different type of tree. So I'm using a square brush. I'm just going side to side to make sort of a triangle shape for my trees. So I could do a vertical line and then do some sort of side to side lines, horizontal lines, using a square brush to create something that looks like a tree. All right, so you're going to see in a couple seconds, you're going to see a small detail brush being used very quickly to give some detail to the trees and make them look a little bit less like blobs. Okay, so now I'm letting dry. At any point during your work, if you just are not feeling how it's going, just stop for a second and let it dry. Make a huge difference in your outlook towards your artwork. All right, so step 5 is refinement. So after I've done sort of the process of blocking in the large areas, getting everything painted that I need to get painted, right? So I needed to get the rocks, I needed to get the water, I needed to get the sky and the trees all blocked in and added. Now I'm grabbing some different materials and I'm going and sort of refining and adding those details, and I'm looking at my reference image for guidance as I'm doing this. So what I'm doing is I am adding some dark areas, remember about the contrast that we're aiming for, and I'm using a brown Sharpie marker. So I'm switching now to an orange marker because I just wanted to get I wanted to exaggerate those orange parts of the rock because I think they're really nice. So I'm doing that. And then I started in with some pastels. So I'm using the pastels and then I'm rubbing them with my finger to blend them in a little bit. If you don't have pastels, that's all good. Pencil crayons can work, wax crayons can work, markers can work, really anything you have on hand to mix in with watercolors just to build up some contrast. So as I mentioned, I'm using the pastels and I'm rubbing them with my finger to blend them in a little bit. And I can layer them and I can go back and interchange back and forth with different materials. So now I'm using markers, and in between each of these, I would really strongly suggest that you just like take a break, step back from your work, especially if you're getting frustrated, if you're not feeling the way that it's going. Take a break, step back, come back to it in a little bit, and I bet you'll feel differently when you get back to it. So I will just let you watch me go through my process of refinement. The whole time I'm using my reference image and the idea that I'm wanting to build contrast in my work, having those very, very dark darks and those very, very light lights. If there's ever a point when I'm noticing that there's too much darkness or there's too much lightness in an area, I'm gonna go and I'm gonna try to fix that up, okay? All right, I'm happy with how this looks now. I'm removing the tape and you will get to see the final product in just 1 second. All right, there we go. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope it helped you to understand the idea of contrast. And I'm really looking forward to seeing the landscapes that you guys create.